What if everything you think you know about the history of Islamic sexuality is only half the story? Not the version taught in classrooms, not the version argued about online. The real story, the one historians and Islamic scholars have pieced together from law books, poetry, court records, and scripture itself. Over the next few minutes, we will travel from the deserts of pre-Islamic Arabia in the year 610, through empires, golden ages, colonial upheavals, and into the digital world of 2026. And by the end, you'll understand why the biggest transformations in this history happened far later and far differently than most people assume, and why the story is nowhere near finished. Here is where we're going. We'll start in the tribal Arabia that existed before the Prophet Muhammad's first revelation. Then we'll watch the early Quranic reforms reshape marriage and family law almost overnight. We'll move through the Rashidun and Umayyad periods, into the intellectual explosion of the Abbasid Golden Age, through the codification of Islamic jurisprudence, into the Ottoman Empire, through European colonialism and the reform movements it triggered, across the 20th century's competing visions of modernity and revival, and finally into today's fractured, hyper-connected, AI-driven world. 14 centuries, one continuous, evolving conversation about intimacy, law, and human relationships. Along the way, we'll see how scripture, culture, politics, and technology repeatedly collided, and how each collision produced not a single answer, but a widening set of interpretations that Muslims around the world still debate today. Picture the Arabian Peninsula in the early 7th century. No single government, no unified legal code. Instead, a patchwork of tribes, each with its own customs around marriage, lineage, and honor. Historians describe this period, later commonly called Jahiliyyah, or the Age of Ignorance, as one where marriage practices varied enormously from region to region, from dowry-based unions to temporary arrangements to practices that gave women very little legal protection. Polygyny was common and largely unregulated. A man could take as many wives as he wished. Lineage often ran through the father alone, and a woman's status depended heavily on her tribe's power. Mecca itself sat at the crossroads of major trade routes, which meant its population was unusually cosmopolitan for its time, exposed to Jewish, Christian, and Zoroastrian communities living nearby, each bringing their own ideas about marriage, celibacy, and family obligation into the same commercial hub. That mixture of influences created fertile ground for new ideas to take root. But then, in 610 CE, in a cave outside Mecca, a merchant named Muhammad received what Muslims believe was the first of many revelations. And what followed didn't just change one man's life. It began rewriting the rules of intimacy for a civilization that would eventually stretch from Spain to Indonesia. Historians studying pre-Islamic Arabia point to a strikingly diverse set of arrangements. Some tribes practiced strict monogamy tied to inheritance. Others allowed multiple wives with no defined limit. Sources describe several distinct marriage forms, some resembling modern contractual marriage, others far more informal. Women's rights to property, divorce, and consent differed dramatically from tribe to tribe. In some communities, women held real economic power. The Prophet Muhammad's own first wife, Khadijah, was a successful merchant who reportedly proposed to him. In others, women had almost no say in who they married. But something unexpected happened as trade routes expanded and cities like Mecca grew wealthy. Tribal customs began colliding with new ideas about individual rights, contracts, and written law. Arabia was a tinderbox of competing traditions, and it was about to meet a text that would attempt to unify them. Poetry from the period, one of the richest surviving records of pre-Islamic life, celebrates romantic longing and desire openly, suggesting that emotional and physical intimacy were already recognized subjects of art and conversation long before any formal legal framework existed. Yet without consistent protections, women's fates often depended entirely on the goodwill of their tribe or husband, and inheritance and property rights, when they existed at all, varied enormously depending on where a woman happened to be born. And that wasn't the biggest change coming. When the Qur'an began to be revealed, it didn't simply describe existing Arab customs. In many places, it directly challenged them. Verses set specific inheritance shares for women at a time when many received nothing. Verses required a marriage contract, or nikah, including a mandatory dower or mahar, paid directly to the bride, not her family. Unlimited polygyny came under new restriction. The Qur'an permitted up to 4 wives, but only with a condition of equal treatment, a condition many later scholars would argue was, in practice, almost impossible to meet, and some modern reformist scholars read as an implicit push toward monogamy. Divorce was formalized with waiting periods designed partly to protect women from ambiguity over paternity and financial support. Modesty and sexual conduct were addressed directly, with the Qur'an describing marital intimacy, and notably affirming non-shameful language for its era, while also introducing strict prohibitions around extramarital relations. Consent within marriage was emphasized as well, with the marriage contract itself requiring the woman's agreement, a legal requirement that, on paper, gave women a formal say that some surrounding legal traditions of the era did not clearly guarantee. But something unexpected happened. These reforms weren't received uniformly. Different regions, once they came under Muslim rule, interpreted and applied these rules according to their own existing customs, creating variation from the very beginning. And that wasn't the last transformation, because after the Prophet's death in 632, the interpretation of these rules would become a matter of empires. Even Hadith literature, the recorded sayings and actions attributed to the Prophet, added further layers of detail on marital conduct, consent, and etiquette, giving later jurists an enormous body of material to draw from, and, inevitably, to disagree over. After 632, the early caliphs faced a new challenge, applying Quranic principles across a rapidly expanding empire that stretched from North Africa to Persia within decades. The Rashidun caliphs relied heavily on companions of the Prophet, who had witnessed the original revelations firsthand, which kept interpretation relatively consistent. But the Umayyad dynasty, beginning in 661, ruled an empire of enormous cultural diversity. Byzantine Christians, Persian Zoroastrians, and countless local traditions all now living under Islamic law. Court life in Damascus absorbed elements of Byzantine and Persian court culture, including practices around concubinage that existed within a legal framework distinct from free marriage, governed by its own detailed rules regarding a child's legitimacy and a mother's eventual freedom. Marriage contracts became more standardized, and the role of professional witnesses and judges, qadis, grew increasingly important in formalizing what had once been an informal tribal matter. But then, something unexpected happened. As the empire's wealth exploded, so did debates over what exactly the sacred texts required versus what was simply cultural habit picked up from conquered lands. Regional governors, far from the capital in Medina, increasingly made their own calls on ambiguous cases, which meant that a marriage dispute settled one way in Damascus might be resolved completely differently in Kufa or Fustat. That confusion would demand an entirely new solution. Beginning in 750, the Abbasid Caliphate ushered in what many historians call a golden age of science, philosophy, and law, centered in Baghdad, a city of libraries, hospitals, and translation houses. This was also the era when Islamic scholarship on sexuality and marriage became remarkably sophisticated and, by later standards, surprisingly frank. Physicians and scholars wrote medical treatises discussing sexual health, fertility, and pleasure within marriage as legitimate subjects of study, drawing on Greek, Persian, and Indian medical knowledge translated into Arabic. Literature of the period, including some tales later folded into collections like 1001 Nights, depicted romance and desire with an openness that surprises many modern readers. At the same time, the era's legal scholars were hard at work systematizing fiqh, or Islamic jurisprudence, turning scattered precedents into structured legal schools. But something unexpected happened alongside this openness. As the empire's court culture grew more elaborate, so did practices of concubinage and the harem system, creating a widening gap between elite court life and the marriage norms most ordinary Muslims actually lived by. And that gap between elite theory and lived reality is a thread that runs through nearly everything that follows. Scholars like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina wrote extensively on reproductive health and contraception, treating these as practical medical matters rather than purely moral ones, while poets and storytellers continued exploring romantic and physical desire with a candor that later, more conservative eras would sometimes find difficult to reconcile with their own norms. Baghdad's markets and salons also became meeting grounds for scholars of different faiths and backgrounds, and this exchange of ideas fed directly into how Islamic scholars approached questions of the body, health, and desire, treating them as fields worthy of serious, rigorous study rather than taboo. By the 9th and 10th centuries, 4 major Sunni legal schools, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali, along with Shia jurisprudence developing in parallel, had each built detailed, sometimes competing, frameworks around marriage, divorce, consent, and sexual conduct. These schools debated minimum ages for marriage contracts, the conditions under which a marriage could be annulled, a wife's right to seek divorce through khula, and the precise obligations spouses owed one another, including obligations around sexual intimacy that jurists treated as a mutual marital right rather than a one-sided demand. Scholars also debated more unusual arrangements, such as temporary marriage, or muta, which remained accepted in Twelver Shia jurisprudence while most Sunni schools came to reject it after the early period. Guardianship rules for a bride, the role of witnesses, and the precise financial protections owed to a divorced or widowed woman were all worked out in painstaking, sometimes centuries-long legal debate, producing an enormous body of legal literature that few outside specialist circles ever fully appreciate today. But something unexpected happened as these legal traditions matured. Rather than converging on one unified Islamic position, jurisprudence became a landscape of legitimate scholarly disagreement known as ikhtilaf, where multiple valid interpretations could coexist. That diversity of opinion, not a single fixed rulebook, is what actually defined classical Islamic law on these matters. Jurists also produced detailed manuals on hygiene, etiquette, and mutual consent within marriage, treating the topic as a legitimate area of religious scholarship rather than something to be left unaddressed. And that diversity would be tested by an entirely new kind of empire. By the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had become the dominant Islamic power, stretching across 3 continents. The Ottomans layered their own imperial legal code, the Qanun, on top of Islamic Sharia, creating a hybrid system administered through an extensive network of religious courts. Marriage contracts were meticulously recorded, and court archives from cities like Istanbul, Aleppo, and Cairo reveal that women regularly initiated divorce proceedings and defended their financial rights under mahar agreements, evidence that women were far more active legal participants than popular imagination often assumes. The imperial harem, meanwhile, became one of the most elaborate and tightly regulated institutions in the empire, with its own internal hierarchy, education system, and political influence, most famously during the so-called Sultanate of Women in the 16th and 17th centuries, when royal mothers and consorts shaped imperial policy. But then something unexpected happened. As European powers grew more powerful and began pressing into Ottoman territory, this centuries-old legal and social order collided head-on with new ideas arriving from the West. Ottoman legal scholars also produced extensive fatwa collections, addressing everyday marital disputes, from disagreements over mahar payments to questions of a husband's financial neglect, giving historians an unusually detailed record of how ordinary households actually functioned, day to day, rather than just how elite theologians said they should behave. Nothing would prepare the Islamic world for what came next. As European colonial powers expanded across Muslim-majority lands in the 19th century, Islamic legal systems came under direct pressure from foreign administrators who imposed new civil codes, often while simultaneously criticizing existing marriage and family practices as backward in colonial propaganda. In response, a generation of Muslim reformers emerged, figures like Muhammad Abdu in Egypt, who argued for reinterpreting classical jurisprudence through ijtihad, or independent reasoning, to address modern conditions while remaining rooted in scripture. Debates ignited over polygyny, child marriage, women's education, and veiling, with reformers, conservatives, and colonial administrators all pulling in different directions, often for very different reasons. Some reformers pushed to restrict polygyny using the Qur'an's own condition of equal treatment as legal justification. Others pushed back, defending existing practice as authentically Islamic against foreign interference. Women's rights advocates, including some of the earliest Muslim feminist writers, began publishing essays and pamphlets during this period, arguing for expanded access to education and a re-examination of veiling practices, adding yet another voice to an already crowded debate. But something unexpected happened. This reform movement didn't produce one unified modern Islamic position. It splintered into multiple, often opposing, schools of thought that are still shaping debates today. Newspapers and early print culture, both tools introduced largely through colonial contact, ironically became the very platforms reformers used to spread their arguments across borders, reaching audiences far beyond what handwritten manuscripts ever could. And the 20th century would multiply that splintering many times over. As colonial empires collapsed and new nation-states emerged across the Middle East, North Africa, and South and Southeast Asia, each country made its own choices about codifying family law. Tunisia's 1956 Code of Personal Status banned polygyny outright. Turkey adopted a fully secular civil code in 1926, replacing Sharia-based family law entirely. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia retained an uncodified, classical Hanbali-based approach. Egypt, Pakistan, Indonesia, and dozens of other Muslim-majority nations each produced their own hybrid systems, blending classical jurisprudence with modern statutory law in strikingly different proportions. Indonesia, home to the world's largest Muslim population, developed its own distinctive blend of adat, or customary law, alongside Islamic jurisprudence and Dutch-derived civil codes, producing family law that looked meaningfully different from anything found in the Arab world. Meanwhile, global conversations about sexuality, contraception, and women's rights, accelerated by radio, film, and eventually television, reached Muslim societies alongside everyone else, sparking new debates about compatibility between tradition and modern life. But then something unexpected happened in the final decades of the century. Access to education, urbanization, and shifting economic roles for women during this period also quietly reshaped expectations around courtship, marriage timing, and family size, often independent of whatever the formal legal debates were producing on paper. That pushback would define the next chapter entirely. Beginning notably with Iran's 1979 revolution, and echoed in movements across the Muslim world, revivalist currents reasserted classical interpretations of family law, reversing some earlier secular reforms and reintroducing stricter dress codes, gender segregation, and family regulations in several countries. At the same time, an entirely different current, Islamic feminism, was emerging, led by scholars who argued that patriarchal interpretations of Scripture were themselves the product of historical context, not divine mandate, and that a return to the Qur'an's original spirit actually supported greater gender equality. These two currents, revivalist and reformist, argued over the same texts and arrived at strikingly different conclusions, illustrating once again that Islam has never had a single monolithic position on sexuality or gender, only competing traditions of interpretation, each claiming scriptural legitimacy. Scholars such as Amina Wadud and Fatima Mernissi became prominent voices in this reformist current, re-examining classical Hadith collections and historical context to argue that many restrictive interpretations reflected the politics of their era rather than the text itself. Meanwhile, migration brought millions of Muslims into Europe, North America, and Australia, creating diaspora communities that had to negotiate all of these competing interpretations alongside entirely new legal systems and social norms in their adopted countries. But something unexpected happened as the century closed. A new technology arrived that would connect every one of these competing voices to a global audience simultaneously for the first time in history. Most people assume the biggest transformation in this history is happening right now, in our own hyper-connected era. But historians would push back on that assumption. The foundational shifts, the Qur'an's inheritance reforms, the codification of jurisprudence, the splintering caused by colonialism, those happened centuries, even a millennium, before smartphones existed. What's different today isn't necessarily the scale of change. It's the speed, and the fact that, for the first time, nearly every perspective in this 1,400-year conversation is now visible, all at once, to anyone with an internet connection. A teenager in Lahore, a graduate student in London, and a retired imam in Cairo can now read the exact same centuries-old legal debate within the same hour, compare it against a dozen other opinions, and form their own view, something that would have been almost unthinkable even 50 years ago, when access to that knowledge depended entirely on geography and privilege. From the early 2000s onward, satellite television, and then smartphones and social media gave ordinary Muslims direct access to religious scholars, reformist voices, conservative preachers, and secular critics, all competing for attention in the same digital space. Online fatwa services let people from Jakarta to Detroit ask deeply personal questions about marriage and intimacy and receive answers within hours, often from scholars representing very different schools of thought. Diaspora Muslim communities in Europe and North America began publicly navigating questions about dating, arranged marriage, and identity in ways earlier generations rarely discussed openly. Meanwhile, several Muslim-majority nations continued actively revising family law throughout the 2010s and 2020s, some tightening restrictions, others loosening them, reflecting the same unresolved tensions that have run through this story since 610. By the mid-2020s, artificial intelligence tools had entered the conversation too, used for religious research, translation of classical texts, and even generating rulings, raising entirely new questions about authority and authenticity that classical jurists could never have imagined, including debates over whether an AI system can ever legitimately issue religious guidance at all, or whether that authority must remain strictly human. Younger generations in many Muslim-majority countries now report forming views on marriage and relationships through a patchwork of family tradition, religious study, social media influencers, and international media, a combination no previous generation in this history ever had to navigate simultaneously. 14 centuries after a merchant in a cave outside Mecca received his first revelation, the debate over marriage, intimacy, and gender in Islamic life is still very much unfinished. Let's move fast now. Tribal Arabia with its patchwork customs. The Qur'an, rewriting inheritance and marriage law almost overnight. The Umayyads, absorbing Byzantine and Persian court culture. Baghdad's golden age, blending frank medical scholarship with elaborate court life. 4 schools of law, disagreeing productively for 1,000 years. The Ottomans, running one of history's most bureaucratically sophisticated legal systems. Colonialism, cracking that system open. The 20th century splintering into a dozen different national experiments. Revivalism and reform, arguing over the very same verses. And now, an AI-connected world where every one of those 14 centuries of argument is happening simultaneously, in real time, in your pocket. Every era added a new layer rather than erasing the one before it. Which is why, even today, you can find Muslims living out interpretations that trace directly back to Baghdad's golden age, the Ottoman courts, or the reform movements of the 19th century, sometimes all within the same city, even the same family. Islamic thought on sexuality and marriage has never stayed the same. For 1,400 years, it has evolved alongside empires, technologies, and the people living inside them, shaped by scripture, law, culture, and constant reinterpretation. The question historians are still asking is simple. After 14 centuries of change, what does the next 100 years look like? Will the fractured, hyperconnected present eventually settle into new consensus, or will it simply add another layer to a conversation that has never actually stopped since that night in 610? History suggests the answer will, once again, be somewhere in between, messy, contested, and endlessly reinterpreted. If this journey through history surprised you, subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shaped human civilization, and let us know in the comments which era of this 14th century story surprised you the most.